1% of this country owns half our country's wealth, $5 trillion. You got 90% of the American public out there with little or no net worth. I create nothing. I own. We make the rules, pal. The news, war, peace, spam, and upheaval, the price of paper clips. We picked that rabbit out of the hat while everybody sits out there wondering how the hell we did it. Now, you're not naive enough to think we're living in a democracy, are you, buddy? It's the free market. Free market. I create nothing. I own.
I always love that section from Wall Street stated by Gordon Gekko. I also love the fact that in an interview with Michael Douglas years later, he stated how when walking down the street, different men would run up to him and say, "Hey, I loved you in Wall Street. You were Gordon Gekko. You influenced me to go into work for Wall Street." And he said he would look at them and say, "But I was the villain." And it's a great comment on the excitement associated with being aberrant and corrupt, especially when it comes to money and power and all of that fanciful romanticism that in our current culture seems to be supported and reinforced, not to mention glamorized. But that statement, "I create nothing, I own," I love that, because it really puts into perspective what the role of anybody's work in the society actually is. What are you creating to help society? And then when it comes to Wall Street, which of course is one of the most powerful institutions on the planet, they create absolutely nothing in and of themselves. You can twist that in regard to investment and production facilities and how money circulates, but in the end, stock traders, some of the most wealthy people on the planet, are engaged in that alone, create absolutely nothing. And I think it's time people think about that, not to mention all the other occupations that also produce absolutely nothing as well, but continue because of the need to keep this system going. So this is our, what is the date? June 17th, Wednesday broadcast. I've got a bunch of questions I'm going to go through for the next 2 hours live, and really quickly, I have some general news. The chapter templates, the generic Zeitgeist web templates, are now out. And right now, we have them for download, but you have to use a password to get into them, only because we're trying to make sure there isn't too much overlap, because we've had tons of requests for this. And if you've emailed me, believe me, I'm going to get it, we're all going to get it, and someone will get back to you with the information within a day or two, because unfortunately our email boxes just get slammed, and we don't have enough people to go through them. So those are there, and for the next probably week, they're going to be available through passwords, so we can figure out and make sure we get everybody for all 50 states, and then we, set up a system where everyone knows what is already taken care of. So there's no overlap. You don't waste a bunch of energy installing the template or getting a website and all of that. So that's that. So be aware of that. It's at least available now. And if you are working in the community section in a state or in a region and you are active, well, please email me if you want the password at media@thezeitgeistmovement.com. I say you're already active because I need to have some general sense of who you are. I don't want random people to I don't want this to backfire on people to create mock sites, because we have RSS feeds that are going into this, and I'm naturally fearful of manipulators, because there's a growing, I'm sure as many of you have noticed, there's been a growing opposition, very, very small, but there's a lot of people that spend an exorbitant amount of time interfering. It's almost like a COINTELPRO thing, but I'm not jumping to any conclusions. So that being stated, what else was there? Yes, 3D animators. I'm getting a lot of emails from people offering 3D animation, their 3D animation expertise. This should go to the Venus Project. Please email Roxanne. You can find the communication on their website, thevenusproject.com. And I know that we have a fairly large 3D animation group that's developed in our local community in the creative team, and that's awesome. But if you want to start doing stuff, you need to start working with them and contacting them. They're working on setting up a page which has different images and basically orienting everybody and getting them working on something. We're going to try and intertwine this. So I'm going to try and intertwine the creative and technology teams with the Venus Project directly, and we have programmers helping to do that and basically making our sites kind of work together. The main issue for the Zeitgeist Movement is the administrative and the communications team. And the second tier, so to speak, at least of importance at this point, is the creative team and the technology team. And those, of course, are more thought exercises, as opposed to, rather than these 3D animation projects and things that are actually very much tangible to help Jacques out. That would be wonderful in their media and to get the stuff out there in really professional form. Other than that, they're kind of thought exercises, and I'm hopefully going to have more time to engage everyone in that and get team heads. So there's some loose team heads already, but I haven't had a chance to filter through everybody and get everyone oriented and understanding how it's actually going to work. And I apologize about that. There's been so much going on in the background. It's been very difficult to keep up with stuff going as fast as we can. As all of you probably know, the German Facebook equivalent, I don't even have the name on me, but that's posted on the news section of the homepage. They banned a couple of our Zeitgeist groups, I believe all of them on their network, some of which had 10,000 members. A bulk email was sent out this week with a form letter that you can link to and send to them. The English is also on the projects page under activism, so if you want to know what you're sending. Please send them an email. I'd say, considering they've not responded to my emails and they seem to just be ignoring the situation and blindly restricting and censoring these groups, it's worthwhile to get a little bit annoying towards them. I don't know what else to do. I don't speak German. If in the German Zeitgeist community, if you do find phone numbers, I think it's worthwhile to try and hunt these people down and get them engaged in conversation. Not only is it bad that these groups have been dismissed, it's really bad that the charge has been presented, which the charge is anti-Semitism, which is absolutely nuts. So if it isn't countered in some way, if we don't react in some way, it's going to embed itself, and eventually you're going to hear some news reporter or somebody say, oh, blah, 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 yeah, that Zeitgeist movement, somehow they're related to anti-Semitism, evidently, according to the German community, and it's going to start rumors, and it's going to be a mess. So please, just send a singular email if you're listening to this broadcast, if you haven't already. And if you got the email, very much we need to react on some level. We'll see how it goes. I think we're not going to see the end of stuff like that, but nevertheless, we have to. This is what the role of the activism team in a lot of ways is to make sure that defamation and stuff like this they don't get away with it. And it's very important. We demand retractions and protect ourselves. And as things grow, it's going to get very powerful in our strategy because there's nothing like this has ever been done before. So once our international communities grow, and say one community gets censored, all the other communities internationally can gang up on the censoring party. And that's I hate to sound crude on that, but that's basically what has to be done at this stage in order to maintain the integrity of this. And the beauty of it is it'll be extremely powerful if we get the numbers to do it, because no singular country will be able to combat something like that when it's international in scope. And since most political movements are usually national, it's very easy for one country to censor a group because there's no confluence in another country to support them. So I hope that makes sense. So I'm going to jump right into your questions. And the first one was actually not the first one, but it's one I'm going to do first. It had to do with this Freedom Radio web video that was on YouTube, where this individual that I am not familiar with, he goes through the second part of addendum, and he makes these I can't say defenses. He makes these incredible statements in refutation of the points that are made, which are extremely academic. It's amazing. Just so you guys know what I'm talking about, it's called Zeitgeist Addendum: the Review. And if you type in Zeitgeist, well, there's probably a few of those, but if you type in Stefan, S-T-E-F-A-N, and then Zeitgeist Addendum into YouTube, you'll find this 30-minute video. I just stumbled upon this because it was in my list of questions, and I got through about half of it painfully. And I'm going to watch the rest of it, but I literally just went through half of it. So I'm going to go through my notes on this for those of you that have seen it. If you haven't seen it, punch it up after this radio broadcast and check it out. Another point, actually, because this is very, very simple to deal with, is the activism team needs to begin countering some of this stuff because I don't have time to do it. Most of the arguments you see against the Venus Project and the concepts of the economic concepts that we put forth that you won't find hardly any economics book whatsoever, because we're stepping farther back than most academics ever step back as far as the perspective. Most of these concepts are easily debunkable, the ones that are put forward in refutation against us, such as this particular web video and this particular individual from, I believe, Freedom Domain Radio. So I'm just going to quickly go through this, trying my best, because I made some quick notes, trying my best to be as clear as possible with some of the elements that he talks about. For instance, at the very beginning of this video, he states that it is untrue that companies prefer no competition. He's basically saying that companies like competition. He makes that statement later in the video, and I'm baffled as to the absolutely illogical basis of this, since competition in the market system in any competitive environment is based on a gaming mentality, and invariably you want to overcome the competition. I think the Rockefeller comment that competition is sin, or maybe it was one of the Rothschilds, and well, they're absolutely right in their worldview. It is sin, because to be competitive, the ultimate goal is monopoly in any type of competitive environment. Otherwise, it wouldn't be competition. You couldn't even call it competition. So it's absolutely illogical to say that companies want competition. You could rephrase it and say companies like seeing new ideas and building upon them. That's totally different than saying that they want competition. There's no corporation in existence that wants competition because it hinders their profit. It's very simple, no logic at all. I have no idea how he could even state that. In fact, bizarrely, the first 10 minutes of this video, he makes a series of point-by-point issues, and he makes these flagrant comments, these kind of really sniveling, weird, point-by-point, aggressive, dismissing comments using terms like embarrassing and idiots, and it's retarded, and it's he even attributes the concept of the labor that we talk about, the removing of monotonous labor, as being induced by a drug idea and pot-smoking, bong-toting hippies that don't want to work. Very derogatory in the absolute presentation of what he did, so it's very hard for me to take it even remotely seriously, because the vested interest, the emotional ego that he shows in this is so powerful that it was really hard to see beyond that. But I'm going to try and be as objective as possible and not be primitive about it and be emotional. But it was very trying to watch this because of how silly some of it really was. And I hate to fall into the same camp of him because he's basically being emotional as well. But we are human in that sense, and these are things that we all work on. Number two, he says that lying doesn't, quote, get very far in a monetary system. And he basically denotes that you can't really lie in a market system. And he's very general about this. He just throws it out there. And, he's referring to the comment by Jacques Fresco where he states that if you're in a store and the owners of the store recognize that the store next to that store, their store, has something cheaper and better, they're not going to tell you that that's there, because if they were that honest, it would hurt their bottom line. And that's not some kind of empirical statement. That's a general statement that's very much true. Otherwise, you wouldn't have advertising. Otherwise, you wouldn't have competitive advertising where they actually start to compare products. The whole thing is a gaming strategy once again. So the concept of dishonesty that he's advocating is extremely convoluted. He has a surface definition of dishonesty and doesn't realize things like planned obsolescence, the deliberate withholding of efficiency. There's many different angles you can look at the tremendous amount of dishonesty in the market system, and which is, of course, lying, and it actually gets you extremely far. Again, he doesn't even elaborate on it. He just throws this stuff out there. So the third thing he says that I've denoted, he states that profits do not come at the expense of people, and this goes back to the prior point. Profits just don't come from the expense of people. That's not true, he states. Well, that might not always be true, but that's extremely true a great majority of the time. And in my experience, pharmaceutical industry, the cancer industry, again, back to planned obsolescence, the expense of people, what does that mean? It means the violation and dishonesty towards people where they have to be forced into something that isn't necessary. And that comes back to, of course, technology. So when you build a car that's going to break down when the warranty happens, which has been denoted, they did build cars, it had been made public that they designed them so they would break down immediately after the warranty is done. That is at the expense of people. It might not seem that way for the first 10 years. So again, it's completely convoluted. I encourage all of you to watch this. Number 4, he goes on to derail that the statement regarding outsourcing is outsourcing. Hold on. He states that the idea that outsourcing invariably hurts an individual or society is, quote, retarded. That was his exact term. And, I'm dumbfounded by the illogical frame of reference for this. I don't quite understand how he can possibly say that. Meaning, if you have a city and people are working in the factory and you have a good employment statistics, and then suddenly the factory learns that they can outsource everything, move the company to another country, well, they're going to lose their jobs. This is very transparent to me. Either he's not explaining himself very well or he doesn't quite know what he's referring to, and I think it's the latter. Then he talks about the statement addendum where, quote, nothing produced in a profit-based society is remotely sustainable or efficient. And he goes on to, that's basically what he states, and then he goes on to describe the history of capitalism and the monetary system, which of course is absolutely beside the point. He misses the point entirely. For what I'm actually stating there, what's been stated has to do with the state of technology. And if the public understood the state of technology at this point, if the public understood they could make a card to last a lifetime, being updated, being designed to be updated just like a computer, the enclosures. Obviously, things have to change. The technology does develop very rapidly, but what we do know about technology is at this stage, we could do a tremendous amount of development based on sustainability and abundance that would basically override the system, which I've presented in the orientation guide many times, talking about cyclical consumption. I believe in absolute truth, the absolute truth of the fact that sustainability, abundance, and sustainability and abundance are the enemies of profit. They have to be. And I've drilled this in many times, and I don't want to go and waste a lot of time. There's tons of other questions. Again, it's really bizarre how he just throws these things out there. And the sad thing is, if someone's watching this and they're not really familiar with economics, they will just believe everything he says because this guy in the little YouTube says it's stupid, and since the individual watching doesn't know any better, and since the guy is so flamboyant about it too, he's quite animated, he has a persuasion, and unfortunately people will just buy it and dismiss those sections of Zeitgeist Addendum. He attacks the statement that abundance is bad for profit. Well, how can he attack that statement? Profit's based on scarcity. The more scarcity there is, the more profit there is. It's very simple. I mean, our cyclical consumption is the way the entire system works. So if you have something highly sustainable and something in immense abundance where it becomes so cheap, in fact, Chris Anderson, if I remember his name correctly, where he talks about free energy in a gift economy, he makes a very good point about this, how electricity is so abundant, the use of the internet and information transfer is so abundant that it's really nonsensical to even have to pay for it anymore. And that's beside the aspect of energy and everything else. Let's see here. So that was the first 10 minutes where he just throws all this stuff out there. And again, I didn't get very far with it because I had to prepare for the radio show, and again, I was really kind of embarrassed watching this. But the profit point he goes into next. He defines profit saying that there's a difference, and this is one of his biggest points. There's a difference between profits from, quote, violence and profits from voluntarism. And he makes this elaborate, later in the video, he makes this elaborate, extended description of the difference of the two, and he brings in the state. And what he doesn't understand is that this is one massive gray area. I think the example he used was someone who gets a gun and robs somebody and pays $50 for the gun and robs $100 from somebody. They make $50 profit. That's not the same, according to him, as general profit that's made from somebody who works in a corporation. He redefines profit in a way that's highly specific and academic. And before I even address that point, what I found even more hilarious in regard to his personality is he says that he summarizes this, what is an arbitrary point, by saying that, quote, if you don't understand the difference between these 2 points, which is what he calls violence-based profit or voluntarism profit, then you are hereby uncredible and don't have a freaking clue what you're talking about when it comes to the economy. If that's his disposition, then he has an extremely bizarre notion of what's actually relevant when it comes to economic discussions. I hate to sound like I'm countering him emotionally, but I'm blown away by this, and people have actually watched this, and I've gotten other emails about it, but this is the first time I've actually watched it, and I was just amazed. So that example that he gives is basically saying that all the profit that was generated for Halliburton, all the profit that was generated, billions and billions of dollars, it's not trillions at this point, for all the corporations that provided munitions for the Iraq War, that's apparently not real profit. That's violence of profit, and they're not the same thing. Well, actually, they are the same thing. The money that was given to Halliburton, what they paid taxes on it, it increased GDP just like any other form of sale or service. It's the exact same thing. If you want to make a difference between the two, generally speaking, I can see how you can move from one point of the spectrum to the other. But the real reality is that there's so much dishonesty that isn't noticed in our current system, which you could equate to this notion of violence that he describes. He redefines the term. You have to watch it to understand what I'm talking about if it doesn't make sense to you right now. And the reality is that there's so much dishonesty in the system inherently that he's not even aware of that it makes the point absolutely moot. The entire basis of acquiring profit and the gaming strategy necessary is inherently violent from top to bottom. It's simply picking what matter of degree you want to go with. So number 11 here I have, what is it right here? Yeah, he goes on to make another variation on this point, talking about institutional theft from service to the consumers. Well, when you have when you have planned obsolescence and the deliberate withholding of efficiency in production, that is institutional theft. You just don't know it. And time passes and it becomes normality because it just seems like that's the way it is. But when you know you can build something that can last for extended periods of time, when you know you can make a treatment that would, say, cure a disease, let alone just keep treating it, then you're withholding efficiency and it's some form of theft one way or another. It's just a different angle. So anyway, that's all I can really say about that because I didn't have a chance to watch most of it. So you guys watch it, and if you have anything that really confuses you, just email media@zeitgeistmovement.com. I'll do my best to respond. But I want to go on to your actual tangible questions and get away from that. The whole thing was just silly. And in the beginning, he talks about being a software salesman. There's a vested element that he has where he was offended emotionally by what was being described, because if what was stated it was true in addendum, it would make him himself look like a dishonest criminal. And when you deal with academics or people in the business field and you present this information, very often that's the reaction that you get. It's an emotional reaction, and logic flies out the window. So I'm going to go number one on your questions. It's actually number two, but we're going to start because I had to move that one up there. Number one, Peter, do you think we should ban things like cigarettes and alcohol that damages other people? When it comes to cigarettes and alcohol or drugs in general, it just goes underground. What we've learned, I think, from this system is that when you outlaw something, it's going to still, especially material elements that are used and abused, they're going to keep coming back. I think the Netherlands had the best model. I don't even know if they're still doing it. I believe they are. But if you're a heroin addict in the Netherlands, you can go and you can get treatment. You can get a clean syringe, and they work to help you. If you keep doing it, apparently they tolerate that. It might cost you some money in the end, but from what I understand, it's absolutely humane, and it's not underground. The more you push things underground, the more they're underground. The more you ban things, the more they go underground, and that's the backwardsness of our system. You have to address root issues, and if people are addicted to drugs, outlawing them isn't going to do anything. So you have to deal with the social issue and grow out of that issue by addressing the reasons why people drink and reasons like that. And the root causes are what are most ignored in our system. Everything is patchwork, so banning things would just be another patch. Number two, hi, Peter. I was wondering how you would overcome the problem that over time many people would forget about certain areas of science and other information because we don't need to know it anymore. Also, if no one has any specific place where they lived and didn't really have their own possessions, I think it was a very good idea, where would we carry our toothbrushes and brush our teeth? Is there some other way to deal with this problem? I don't really consider it a problem. I think you're slightly overthinking the issue. It's not that you won't have things to carry around with. Why would someone steal your toiletry bag when they can get it themselves? And as far as people overcoming the automation aspects, they would constantly be learning. It's not that we forget. There's always new things to learn. There's plenty of things that we probably don't know how to do now. Most people don't know how to do, say, find water in the desert by different associations that can be made. That's probably an erroneous association. There's if you look at like people that work in tracking animals, there's all sorts of knowledge that they have that's very specific, very primitive, but if you were, say, out of modern society, you would have to learn how to survive in the forest, how to do many things that you don't know now, because it's not necessary because you live in a society. That pattern will continue, but I don't think people will just forget everything and be, stupid and not know what to do if, say, a computer breaks down. I really don't think that's going to be an issue. In fact, once we get those other problems taken care of, where people don't have to worry about mechanical human functioning, you'll see a highly elevated plateau of human intellect and awareness when we don't have to deal with that stuff or focus on that stuff anymore. I think there'll be plenty of situations where people will understand how the system works. And while certain things might be outgrown, I don't see it as a growing problem because the information will still be there. Granted, remember, it's an informational age. It's an information age we're in now. So if somebody forgot something, it'd be very easy to find out what they forgot if they just had the frame of reference of where to look. Number three. Dear Peter, from what I have seen, you seem to support the idea that we are empty vessels upon birth and that everything we know is conditioned into us. This view seems to be unsupported, like with people like Chomsky and Pinker, and they say it's just wrong. Can you explain your disposition? Well, first of all, I don't believe that human beings are empty vessels at all. There's powerful genetic elements to who we are naturally. The difference between a human being and a dog is obviously genetics. A dog can't learn how to speak. We do have the genetic capability to learn how to speak and communicate in the way that we do. You could argue a dog could speak to a certain level, but it's extremely primitive. So obviously, I don't agree with the blank slate idea. I don't agree with any of those early concepts. What we talk about is the value systems and why people behave the way they do when it comes to society, and the way they think about each other and the way that they think about themselves as well. The belief systems that they endure are heavily conditioned. So that's really it. And I try to keep it as simple as that. I mean, there are certain genetic things that are worth pointing out. Instinct, that is this empty word, such as a bear that, because of the temperature, will hibernate. Someone seeing this, not understanding the bear's physiological relationship to the temperature, they will say it's instinct when it's not just blind instinct. It's an empty word. It has to do with a physiological relationship to the environment. So really, when it comes to genetics, it has to be triggered. For instance, I think I agree with Chomsky and Pinker when they talk about the genetic basis of language, not specific languages, but language in and of itself. Because there have been examples of what you call feral children, such as I was just reading about this young girl many years ago that was kept in a singular room for 10 years, and she couldn't speak, she never spoke, she never learned to speak, she had extremely limited contact with another human being. And when they brought her out, I believe at age 10 or 11, they tried to teach her how to speak. And they spent years and years and years trying to teach her how to speak with certain progress, but it was very limited. So what that means is that there might be a frame of time based on the genetics of the human being that where language is key to develop. And I think a lot of people, that seems pretty obvious for most people. And then once you reach that point where a child has no exposure to the human language and they've passed that point, it becomes much more difficult, and who knows, maybe it can't be done to the highest proficiency. These are all debatable things, but I think there's information there that's worth considering. I believe it supports the reality that genetics set propensities, but it's the environment that really triggers those propensities. And that's really what my position is, generally speaking. That's a huge topic, and if you want more information on that, I think it's well described both in Jacques' book, The Best That Money Can Buy, and also in the 83-page PDF that has a whole section on nature versus nurture and human behavior. Number 4, will the highly necessary experimental city also be used to investigate alterations in human behavior? For example, would families be created in the environment of this city to study the evolving behavior of humans not exposed to the monetary system? Well, I'm not quite sure exactly what you mean. We're not going to do experiments on people. The system itself is, in a sense, the experiment. Highly fortified by intellectual reason. There's obviously we have to test all these things out, but the first step of the scientific method is to use our inferential understanding, and based on what we understand, this new system will be so much better for humanity to live in and create much more welcoming behavior towards each other and our own personal happiness. So that is going to be an ongoing experiment. There's really no beginning or end to that. And our current system now is an experiment. We've seen what our system has done. So we'll always be investigating human behavior. That's an ongoing process. Number 5, what if government learned of your ideas and twisted and turned them to benefit them and applied it, or twisted your words to make people think bad about this movement and put it on the news? Well, that's going to happen. That's going to happen, and the twisting has already begun with small sects, and as things get bigger, it's the old adage, they ignore you, they attack you, and then hopefully they accept you. But nevertheless, I expect many more attacks from all walks as this stuff progresses and more people join. Just as that individual I just described that had the YouTube video, Stefan something, his attacks were amazing. And those that watched him and don't have a background will naturally gravitate towards the emotional capacity and the identification with the arrogance that he portrays. So when you say something just stupid, moronic, and oh my God, this is just ridiculous, and you just pontificate and pontificate, people just will blindly want to identify with that. People love to identify with others, people in this culture love to identify with others that are above something, and they think they're on some elite plane, and sadly that seems to persist and is, of course, reinforced by our system. Number 6, one problem that I see is the ability for people to get almost any item at any location at any time. This could result in people simply wasting resources and requesting duplicate items that may not be used, which results in pollution Should the system restrict multiple requests within a certain time frame, or should we develop a recycling system for unused items? Is there another system you've thought of to prevent this? There's no other system I've thought of to prevent this, but you have to remember what the question really is. Why would somebody want to go to a distribution center and get 100 microwaves? You know, why would someone want to, unless you're doing some big art installation, and who knows, you could make way for that, but you've got to really be practical about the different association people have with this system. When you're moving away from the notion of protecting resources and distributing scarcity, you know, harnessing scarcity and figuring out a system to distribute the scarcity, you're moving out of that system into a system of the problem being how to distribute the abundance, which is there. You're going to see an entirely huge shift in the way people think. So wasting resources, you know, we'd have to see what happens. I don't think there'd be a huge gravitation towards that. Whatever situations like that do occur, yes, recycling will be built into the system. Recycling is very important to this. We make things so they can very easily be mutable back into the system so they can be reused. And that's something that is very few and far between in our current culture. And that was also made very clear in the presentation, the 83-page guide, and also the orientation video where we talk about recycling, how it's an integral part. As far as the human behavior aspect, we'll have to see. But once you remove scarcity from the equation, there's very little reason for people to do this. And once the value system is established, which I believe will be established, where people just get really sick of property and they don't want to own things, they want to travel, they want to have minimal stuff to carry around while they get the resources wherever the location they are, it will create an entirely new worldview where people don't want to hoard things. They won't have that. They won't have that necessity. Hoarding is a very primitive thing. I think you see hoarding happen in the animal kingdom a lot. You see in scarcity-driven environments, an organism will hoard a lot, and humans do the same thing. And I think that will be grown out of. Number 7, I'd like to ask if you have an opinion as to why the bankers want everyone under their control. I know this means they have virtually limitless power, but I want to know what you think they want with this limited amount of power. Do you think it's simply because they're afraid of losing it, or that it is something ingrained in them that makes them want to continually get more power? Well, I do not believe it has anything to do with anything ingrained in them, and that goes back to the nature versus nurture argument. Greed is a manifested element. Human society was not always like this. Human society was not always just people wanting everything and constantly wanting more and more property. This has been manifested provably. As a statistic I stated before the World War II, consumption was half in America. It was the imposition of the corporations to their advertising agencies to rank up consumption, because that's what powers the entire economy. And I hope everyone's clear on that. As far as the bankers that want everyone under their control, I think you're a little misguided on this, maybe. It's not just that there's these rogue bankers. Bankers happen to be in that position. It would make sense of their positions of power coupled with government, because they have so much power as it is. Naturally, they want to preserve it, and they're involved in the processing of probably the most aberrant producing mechanism that we know today, and that's the monetary system. So, but to clarify your point here, your issue here, it's not really the bankers. In this system, power is created, and people want to maintain that power because of their own self-perpetuation, and that's what they do. So their actions to get systems under control, to restrict the population, as all governments have done, is a self-preservation mechanism. It's not ingrained in them. It's just what has to be done in the system. It's literally built in. Otherwise, you would never have an empire. You would never have any type of monopolistic orientation. You would never have multi-billion-dollar companies. Self-preservation is what causes all of that. Hold on a second, I lost my place. Here we go. Number 8, first, I don't understand how the collapse of the world monetary system will occur. If people lose their purchasing power by losing their jobs, it's because the industries keep the money for themselves. Then they have greater purchasing power, so purchasing power to sustain the system won't disappear. Actually, that's not necessarily true, because when people lose their jobs, they are losing their ability to be consumers, and it's the consumers that perpetuate, quote, the self-preservation of the corporations. In other words, you have to pay somebody to go and buy something else. So if you get rid of the consumer, which is people losing their jobs, losing their purchasing power, then the establishment has nothing. This is the collision of capitalism, the contradiction of capitalism, that has been talked about before. And that's what's, again, going to probably have a big stake in this system shutting down. Because the more automation that's brought in to save money, the more people that are displaced, and therefore more people are without the purchasing power to support the industry in abstraction that made the robot that implied the robot to begin with to replace the human labor. Let me state that better. It's a cycle. So the owner pays the employee becomes a consumer, and in theory would buy back from the owner or a owner. So if you have widespread displacement of human beings in the system, that's a displacement of the consumer, and therefore no money is going to be cycling. So I hope that makes sense. Number 9, Peter, I just wanted to know what your views on transhumanism and the eventual human transcendence into the digital realm. It seems to me the Venus Project is a perfect end to the monetary imprisonment we all live in, but an even better beginning to humanity's marathon towards singularity. Singularity is a term put forward by Ray Kurzweil, and I've been beginning studying Kurzweil. I've been aware of him for a while, but the notions of transhumanism have a strong affiliation with him. I ignore these terms, and I simply look at the logic behind it. And I suggest that for everybody out there. When you hear anybody throw out terms, any of the stuff that's being used against us, or any terms in general, communism, capitalism, transhumanism, even these guys that say we're theosophists, there's all these words that have been thrown out there, and all these irrational associations have been made because of these strange little hints of association that have been found and exploited. You have to just ignore the words and look at the definition of what all of the terms are, and then figure out what the actual train of thought is. So when people say the Zeitgeist Movement is transhumanist, first of all, it's ridiculous, and that has been stated, by the way. I'm not saying that the person who writes this question is assuming that, but when I use the term transhumanism, I just break it down to a fundamental thing, and transhumanism, its basic sense, and I know some transhumanists will disagree with me, but its basic sense is the incorporation of machine into the human being, which is no different than wearing a pair of glasses. It's no different than certain seizure, I believe Parkinson's patients, some of them have chips in their brains already that help control certain tendencies that they fall into that actually can have software loaded into them. A pacemaker. So I look at it from that standpoint. If we can help ourselves and improve ourselves with technology, what's the problem? And it's the moral people that get all out of control with this, and these very strange guys out there that they're Luddites, and they're absolutely in fear of anything new. And fear is the biggest driving mechanism. But let me answer your question, actually. I think I didn't even answer your question. Would the Venus Project perfect this? Well, sure, it would perfect any type of technology that helps the human being. That's the whole point. That's what technology is. That's the point of technology. Any other technology is just meaningless, is just that, meaningless. We want to use technology for the betterment of human society. And it's time we focus our energies on that and away from this monetary game that is damaging us day by day. Number 10, what would happen to gift-giving occasions in a resource-based economy? What would happen to gift-giving occasions if everybody had everything they wanted? There would be no reason to promote gift-giving occasions such as Christmas. You're absolutely right. There would be no reason. Christmas is a manufactured Christmas, just like Easter, just like Valentine's Day. All that stuff is manufactured for consumption. Granted, I can see the romanticism. It's great to appreciate this and that of your families and what have you, but that's different than what's actually being incorporated. I don't give anybody anything on Christmas. I very rarely give anybody anything on their birthday. I truly try to promote a new system where you call them and you're nice and you acknowledge this and that. But the concept of constantly buying and giving people stuff is utterly an economic thing, and I think most of you know that. So I would love to see this whole nonsense of gift giving go out the window, because who cares? Why is giving somebody some material object a representative of something of your interest in them? There's all sorts of ways that you can express your interest in another human being without having to give them some material good, which is usually pointless if you look at most of the stuff that's given these days and during Christmas and all the holidays. Number 11, when are we likely to see a trailer for the upcoming third film? I recall it was stated to be announced. It was stated at the announcement of the third film that a trailer would be available not long after Z-Day. I really don't know, but I'm shooting. I was trying to get the film out faster, but based on how much administrative work I have to do, it's not going to happen the way I want it to. The October date of 2010 should be fine. I'll probably have a trailer, hopefully by Z-Day. That would be a great strategy. I'll release the trailer on Z-Day, and the release will be soon after that, a couple months later, hopefully the latest in October. I'm still doing preliminary work on that, and I have to kind of get all of these bugs worked out with the website and help everybody with the groups before I can really focus on it, because once I start focusing on it, I'm going to have to kind of vanish from the scene for a little while, as you would imagine. Number 12. How will the first cities work to give everyone abundance if we haven't gotten the world's resources together yet? How will the first city... Oh, well, first of all, the first city isn't necessarily a city that's designed to produce an abundance. It's a research facility. And I think that's very important, that we develop an open research facility, not some commune, but something that has been very, very deliberately created to show examples of all the attributes that would exist in the system, not to mention other important things that are relevant to human society. It would be a display city that people would come in and learn about, and hopefully through time, and this is sort of speculative, but you'd have research facilities begin to develop all over the world. And then from there, they would serve as the hubs of creation, say, where the architects work and where the city planners work, to begin creating the real city with resources in the communities near them. So, and again, as far as your general question, we haven't gotten the world's resources together because they're all held by private corporations, and this is going to be one of those hurdles that I cannot sit there and answer with any validity about how that's going to work out. But we know that the path is clear as far as what needs to be done. So as I stated, and as been stated, Jacques stated repeatedly, the carrying capacity of the Earth has to be assessed. We have to understand what we have and then start looking at the technology we have to, say, overcome scarcities that are actually real. And we can do that through substitutions. So until we understand the carrying capacity of the Earth, we are on the outs, but we do know enough about energy and do enough about the resources that have been released, the statistics that have been released, to know we can definitely create abundance on this planet, and it's fortified by the use of technology. Number 13. I don't know a lot about communism, but someone told me it has no monetary system and nothing to do with money. Would you please clarify the difference between communism and the Venus Project for me? Well, I don't have time to sit here and do it because I've done it many, many times. A few radio broadcasts ago, I addressed Ed Griffin's article that essentially said we're communists, and I went point by point with those issues. There's also a great Q&A written by Jacques. I'm not sure what number it is, but you'll find it, and it says, I believe the question is, how isn't this just communism, or what is the relationship to communism? First of all, the idea that communism never had money, well, that was never in practice. And there were some ideological statements that were made by early forefathers of communism where they stated that the highest echelon would be without money. But that never came into practice, and the root causes of the reasoning behind that as far as scarcity and using technology for abundance were never really talked about, at least not really. There was a lot of speculative comments, but to answer your question simply so I can move on, communism in its existing forms, as it has ever existed, was always dealing with money. So we can't assume the ideological assumptions that were made. We can't assume their validity without a lot more scrutiny to figure out how the foundation of their statement. And I don't know their foundation of their statement. I've never seen information that really explains what they meant by that. Number 14, in a resource-based economy, what will the phrase, everyone is entitled to their own opinion, mean? With language moving towards a more mathematical approach, will opinions dissolve? The real test is the scientific method. If someone has an opinion on something, we put it to test. That's basically it. If, this is a complex emotional area with heavy romanticism. I have people coming up to me and say, well, you're atheist. Well, that's just another faith. And you're no different from my Christian faith. And when they make that comparison, the comparison is ultimately a completely unthought out concept. It's a rejection of the idea that there's feedback from the environment and that we can support what we understand by feedback. I understand the law of gravity as far as how we understand gravity today. I know I can't just arbitrarily stand up in my room and walk on the wall and walk on the ceiling and walk back down. I have to have lots of tools to do that if I was to even technically do it at all. So the point being is that it doesn't matter how much faith I have in walking on the wall. I've gotten enough feedback from the environment to know it's not going to happen. So the scientific method is the test for this, and everyone is entitled to their own opinion is an old notion that has been thrown out there, and I believe it's a dangerous notion in abstraction because it doesn't talk about information and knowledge. So entitled to your own opinion, sure, if you want to look at it in an abstract sense, everyone's entitled to their own opinion. It doesn't mean you're going to have any basis to act on it. It doesn't mean it can be applied in any constructive way. If I want to believe for the rest of my life I can walk on the wall and that's my opinion, as long as I don't try to do it, well, hey, I'm safe. I can keep that belief for the rest of my life, and that's my opinion. So I hope that answers your question. As far as your other point, as far as language moving towards a mathematical approach, we can only hope that. I've yet to find yet to have an utterly clear notion about how language will evolve, but I do hope it moves along the lines of mathematics, generally speaking. I believe Jacques has made that statement as well. Number 15. However, in our monetary system economy, thousands, if not millions, of Aboriginous cultures have been led to their extinction. In my country, Colombia, there are still hundreds of Aboriginous cultures that have managed to survive despite colonialism and capitalism. An indigenous group is fighting against gold exploitation by a Canadian corporation in their territory because it is a sacred place for them. And the presence of the gold there is fundamental to preserving the equilibrium of the planet according to their culture. The same happens to be another group that is fighting against the construction of a major port in their sacred land that they need culturally to balance their territory. How would the Venus Project deal with these situations? They'd be dealt with very carefully because you're dealing with old belief systems. You're dealing with old opinions. And I can't sit there and be romantic about it and say that everything can just be anything. That's nothing can work out like that. The hope is that the people that live in the cultures will, if their land is needed for something, it's made clear to them. And if you explain that, for example, if resources in a particular area aren't utilized, especially when you don't have money involved, okay, I can completely relate right now to these groups because they're being pillaged for monetary resources, and they're probably given virtually nothing. There's plenty of examples of the Amazon, people in the Amazon being beaten down and slaughtered for deforestation projects, for oil projects. There's a number of terrific books on that I don't have in front of me I should post. But nevertheless, in the Venus Project, where you're using resources for real terms, you would communicate with these indigenous groups to show what it's for, and you would hope that the education would surmount the cognitive dissonance. But I can't give you a clear answer to that. Cultures will have a place, and it's been noted before that there's a transition, and we have to constantly have a flexibility with different cultures that have different belief systems to help in the transition towards more rationality. And those are all very testy subjects, and people will love to shoot you down when you say that because they think you're being elitist or they think you're imposing this and that on them. But the very reality is that there is a scientific method. There is a way that we can use resources in the most efficient manner to feed and clothe everyone in the most highly spiritual ways that you could ever consider. And until people kind of understand that, we just have to keep working on them. It isn't just some random idea. It's an ongoing development like anything else, but we've seen the light to a certain degree of how to focus society in a way that's most productive for everyone. Number 16. How do you envision the use of money through the transition period to a resource-based economy? Will the use of money ease all at once, or will people gradually stop using it as more and more goods become abundant and available to all? Well, there's two ways to look at this. As far as I know, about 100 years ago, there were economists that were aware of growing technological unemployment, and the pattern that was discussed was that eventually the work week would be broken down. So instead of working 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, you begin to work 5 hours a day, 5 days a week, or 4 days a week for 8 hours a day. It was the idea that there would be a natural gravitation, that the corporations would step aside and understand what they're doing and take society into account for the betterment as a whole. Obviously, that hasn't happened. World unemployment has been nothing but growing. World poverty has been nothing but growing. The UN just released a new report that the poverty level, the death by starvation is growing in third world countries, which has always been growing, but they just released a thing on that. And one thing to know about the UN is everything statistically that they release is always going to be shortchanged, so the numbers that they released, I think, are much lower. But nevertheless, the use of money, in my true opinion, it's going to be more staggering than that. There's going to be big fallouts. There's going to be a lot of probable chaos where the system starts to break down in massive ways in specific areas of the country. I really don't know how it's going to work out. I would love to see the transition work in a step-by-step manner where you slowly eradicate the use of money, but the problem is that there's too much vested interest. There's too many people in positions of power, and as long as they still have that power, they're going to continue to perpetuate what's necessary to maintain that power. And in order to do that, they want to make sure the system is basically intact. The work week has basically expanded as far as I can see. In the industry that I used to work in and still unfortunately have to engage in advertising, the average work week for most of the people I worked with was about 60 hours, 65 hours a week. and they made salaries on a 40-hour schedule. And you see this quite a bit. So to answer your question, I really don't know. I don't think it's going to be step-by-step, though, because the power establishment won't want it. I'm going to talk a bit more about that subject in detail in the new film as well, because it's a very important point, and I'm at least going to present the best thought-out approaches I can think of to get people to understand how the transition can work. I think communities are going to have to start, coupled with the research centers, but I don't want to go into all that now because it takes a great deal of thought to consider how that's going to work out, and a great deal of inference as far as historical reference to kind of see what the patterns might emerge to be. Number 17. If we go back a few hundred years, the Venus Project would obviously not be possible. No resources or goods were mass-produced, and all work was done through human labor because technology was nowhere near what we have today. A world of abundance couldn't be achieved. So then what was the best system? So you're asking me what the best system was in the early years? Well, actually, it depends on the way you look at it. As Jacques denoted in the Fiji Islands, excuse me, I think it was Fiji, whatever I can't remember now, but if you go back and look at some of his interviews, he lived on an island with an indigenous culture in what he called a resource-based economy. Very few of them worked many, many hours a day. It was very simplistic, their society. They regarded the carrying capacity of the island. If the population grew too much, they would agree to send others to other islands in the surrounding area because they couldn't support everybody. So there was definitely a scarcity there, but they had an extremely great strategy to support it. And it was, in Jacques' words, a resource-based economy because it didn't use money, it didn't use barter. Everyone contributed collectively, and everyone benefited holistically. And there was a great deal of respect, from what I understand. So it depends on the way you want to look at it. Obviously, the Venus Project is based on an advanced form of this, utilizing what we understand about science and technology in its most modern capacity. And so you're half right and you're half wrong. I mean, in a lot of ways, it isn't even about the technology per se as the value systems that we're trying to go after. We're trying to stop all the aberrant behavior in our culture. And the only way to do that is to ease the pressure and the stress on society as a whole, which has been manufactured through the scarcity and oppression that goes on daily through the government and corporate complexes for their own self-preservation. That's not to say it didn't have value before. The free market system, the institution of government has had value, and all of the byproducts that we've seen of the aberrant behavior has been, unfortunately, a natural result, and it's been tolerable, I suppose, because certain things have progressed. But now we understand that we can move past this, and we don't have to have people slitting each other's throats. We don't have to have people constantly parasitic and leeching off of each other, which is all the industries do, is one big parasitic mechanism. We don't have to have that done anymore. That's what we've come to understand. So we want to create a culture that actually works and that it doesn't have the propensity to blow itself up every year with nuclear weapons and new technologies and doesn't even have an interest to even pursue things like that because the reasoning is gone. So I hope that makes sense. Number 18, there's a serious problem people have with the Venus Project, and that is believing that not all services, goods, and resources can be abundant. In this way, humans can handle what resources that cannot yet be abundant by current technology. Undoubtedly, there will be a mixture of the monetary system and a resource-based economy in transition. The monetary side should be the best system possible using money. Do you agree or disagree? I generally agree, actually. I think we're going to have a hybrid. That's what the transition will be. But the thing is, I don't see the financial powers rolling over. This kind of goes back to the earlier question. I don't know how to do it. None of us know how to overcome the opposition except through what I consider to be a rejection of the system and the advocacy of the new system and creating mass awareness. It's a difficult subject, and I wish I had more answers for you. But let me make sure I covered all the aspects of that question. Yes, I think I've addressed that. There will be a mixture until the scarcity is overcome through the technology. And the deliberate focus on the production of abundance is made as opposed to the deliberate preservation of scarcity, which is what goes on today. Let's see. Number 20, every living organism strives to reproduce as much as possible and with as little effort as possible. That is a great rule of evolution. Every organism that does not comply with it is outcompeted in the evolutionary process. Why would man be an exception from this great rule? This is one part of his question. Let me go back to this. Well, every organism strives to reproduce as much as possible with as little effort as possible. This is the great rule of evolution. There's many caveats to that statement that I'm not going to jump into right now. As far as man being an exception from this, I don't even know your frame of reference set. Let me go on to the next question. The problem is that you give everyone practically unlimited. The problem is that if you give everyone practically unlimited resources, as will be in the Venus Project, this will lead to two things. People will spend less and less time working for the production of goods and more time seeking pleasure, since seeking pleasure is less effort than producing goods. This is the second part of his question. Well, first of all, let me state that people will spend less and less time working in monotonous and arduous jobs that are not relevant to survival or don't produce anything that's relevant to social survival. There's a difference there. I don't see some drop-off where people just suddenly stop wanting to do anything. People have a natural interest to do things. And I think if you guide their focus in education, there's tons of things. I love the example of a child. Children have an immense curiosity, and I think that has been ripped out of people as they get older, as they're forced into the economic system. All that creative interest, all the free-running, curiosity. Humans, I think, invariably are very curious, and if it's a human nature thing, I have no idea, but it's definitely a pattern that I see. People like to learn, and unless they become distorted and it becomes painful to learn. And I think there's certain things I have actually in my memory where I still have associations with certain things that I learned in the past, and I really hated the school teacher. I really hated the way it was presented, and I have a certain suffering when I have to go back to those subjects because of this association's been set up. As one of many points to make as far as this is concerned. I don't believe humans are inherently lazy or any of that stuff. So I don't think people will spend less and less time working. They will spend more and more time working on things that are actually relevant and can contribute to society. Let me finish his question. At the same time, they will have as many children as possible, since the children of those who make more children will eventually outnumber the children of those who make less children. Is this not a recipe for disaster? Well, first of all, I have no idea how you can find that statement to be true, because I find no evidence for that. Just to think that people have more time, they're going to have more children, does not take into account the educational element where people will understand the carrying capacity of the earth. They have to understand how society works. No one understands this yet. It's no coincidence that poverty-stricken people tend to have many more children than upper-class wealthy people. I think it partly has to do with education, has to do with management of resources and time, but it also has to do it primarily has to do with the value system in education to understand the relevance of having a child. And I think Jacques has the best statement on that. Why do you have children? Why? And no one would even know how to answer that question. And I think Jacques' poetic notion that you have them to make them better and smarter than you are, to create them as a product, which is essentially what they are, is the goal that people should have when they have children. So I disagree with you with the statement that just because people have more time, they'll have more children, because that doesn't make any sense to me. I don't see any evidence of that necessarily. Number 21, do you know how we can deal with intelligent design movement? I have noticed their ability to want to teach creationism and even their agenda to subvert scientific materialism, which has helped create our society and technology in almost every aspect of science, good and bad, for a faith in God. The intelligent design movement has two facets that I've come to understand. I ignored all of that for years, but you have this group that's religiously inclined, and you have this other subgroup that claims not to be religiously inclined, though they often have associations, to say that they don't know, but because they don't know if it was God or not, but something created us, and this comes into aliens and things like this, where there was a seed planted, so to speak, and humanity was born of some type of social experiment many years ago. Obviously, the latter would be more probable than the former, but nevertheless, the thing is that I just don't even see the point of this discussion even occurring, because in the end, when you pin these people down, they'll come up with this question of, well, how did life begin? Well, how do you know that life wasn't always here? This idea of beginning and ending it seems rational because we see things start and see things end, sort of. But when you look at molecular technology, when you think about the quantum field, when you look at the way molecules are transferred from one to another and energy not being created or destroyed, you have to ask yourself, is there really such a thing as a beginning? And you can even get more bizarre than that and say things like, well, maybe the beginning of maybe the beginning is not, say, the egg of a chicken. The chicken is actually the end of the egg. You could do all sorts of bizarre notions like that. Actually, that made no sense. I was trying to find a better example for that. You could twist the beginning and the endings and reverse them, and it would still seem logical because it's our frame of reference that makes it seem rational that something begins and something ends. Life obviously continues, And there's mysteries to that, but nevertheless, did I even answer your question? I don't even think I answered your question. So let me hear. As far as their agenda, I think that the intelligent design movement has very little basis, and it's very little support in light of what we understand about evolution. There's plenty of things in evolution that need improvement, that need more research, obviously, but it holds up to a tremendous scrutiny in innumerable scientific experiments. So I think it's the kind of thing that we just kind of have to keep education going in a positive direction. And stuff like this, like lots of other erroneous belief systems, will just lose more and more support, and they'll slowly kind of fade away. Number 22. It seems as if a good portion of movement members are more focused on the conspiracy material as well as things that simply cannot be established as true or false. Is there something that can be done to remind individuals to remain focused on this, on the important topics of the movement, and at least stay in the arena of what can be possibly done? I understand what you're saying. There's a lot of outlandish things that are brought in, I think, just because people like to talk about them. Overtly esoteric issues. You have to kind of just weed through it. I don't know what else to say. For those of you on the forum that have problems with posting, irrational, irrelevant things, the best thing you can do, moderators take care of this, that's their role, but it's just kind of don't acknowledge it. So if you see erroneous posts, just move on, because if you jump into these erroneous posts and you start feeding it, it just keeps going, and it's really bizarre how some of these really irrelevant points just keep propagating and pontificating. So anyway, the movement members are guided on the forum by the moderators, and the materials that I release, I hope, will gauge people in the right direction more so, and more material will be released, so that's the best we can do. Number 23, what are your views on spirituality? As not related to religion, but in a more symbiotic principle, I find spirituality to be extremely simple. It's merely the interconnection of virtually everything, which is absolutely transparent. I have lots of romantic expressions I use in Zeitgeist Addendum, and the oneness, I think, is absolutely apparent. It's just extremely practical and extremely obvious to realize. If we have to take care of the environment we live in, and spirituality to me is basically an association with something else. It's an interconnectivity. So there's lots of beautiful statements done by poets about spirituality in all religious texts, but when it comes down to it, what's tangible, what's actually relevant, what actually does something? And the notion of functional spirituality, I really appreciate that term. And that's usually the term I try to bring up when people start talking about stuff like that, when you pin them in a corner and ask them what their spirituality actually does. For example, the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not steal. That doesn't give you any information at all. Well, why? Why should you not steal? Or thou shalt not kill. I find it interesting that in the Quran they make it a little bit different. They actually have more reasoning, bizarrely. I don't identify with the Quran, but I find it amazing that their reciprocation statement is, do not do harm unto others, for it will allow them to do harm unto you, or something to that effect. So it's a little bit more rational because they actually pinpoint it, because that's really what the reality is. It's a cause and effect thing. If you're going to be abusive towards somebody, you're going to grow abuse. You see this with generations and generations of physical child abuse. These patterns are concrete. My mother was a social worker for many years. I spent many hours discussing aberrancies of the human condition with her, and she had the extremely arduous position of having to deal with some of the most complex and horrifying social environments you could ever imagine, especially when it comes to family. Men trading their entire family for a pickup truck. I could go on and on and on. That's one of the first one of my first experiences of learning about society, was to see how incredibly sick some aspects of society are. And the funny thing is you can pinpoint the sources very, very easily. So functional spirituality is the term. Number 24. Peter, if machines will not monitor people, what can we do if a person starts fabricating weapons? That's really the wrong question. The question is, what do we do about the motivations that want someone to attain a weapon? You have to stop. It's like that old question, who makes the decisions in a resource-based economy? That just completely derails the entire logic of the decision-making process, the basis of what a decision is, why decisions are made. It's not who makes the decisions, it's how are the decisions arrived at. It's what is the process of decision-making. So back to your question, what is the process that makes someone want to fabricate a weapon? And usually it has to do with an insecurity of some kind. If someone's fabricating weapons to stick them on the wall just to look at it, well, there's no harm in that. But if someone's given a position of depravity, if someone's raised in an aberrant condition where they have felt like it was acceptable in their inner circle to shoot and kill people, which is somewhat common today, not as much as it used to be. If you go back to lynching in the early 20th century, that was a common community thing. And so those points being noted, you have to talk about the root causes. And the monitoring isn't necessarily going to do anything. In this culture, unfortunately, you have to be somewhat a protectivist in general, but you have to also remember that security is basically nonsense. There's no such thing as security in our culture whatsoever. It doesn't matter how many cameras you have. It doesn't matter how many belligerent people you have to deal with when you get on an airplane. It doesn't matter, because anybody can do anything if they want to. So given that, and what I mean by that is anybody can kill you if they want to. Anybody can blow up a building if they really, really, really want to. Anybody can take down a plane if they really want to. Anybody can do any of it. There's no such thing as security. And knowing that, we have to begin to address the root causes, because otherwise it's just nonsense. I can do nothing but cringe when I see Dick Cheney keep popping up on the news talking about how unsafe America is and how another 9/11 is going to definitely occur. It's going to be bigger, and it's probably going to be nuclear. This old, sick fearmonger. He perpetuates this because that's the establishment he's promoting, both ideological and in his profit system as well, the war industry. So you have to see beyond that. You can't assume that security is going to be the end result. In a temporal sense, there's certain things that are logical to do, and that can go in many different facets, from even walking on the side of a cliff. But when it comes to social security, when it comes to people fearing each other and the world we live in today with this overinflated idea of terrorism, you have to just pretty much put it aside and think about why people are doing it. Because if you get involved in the notion of prisons and police and more metal detectors and more guns, and we should get a gun and have a gun and all of this crap that's perpetually put out there by many, many different people in all walks, because they're so ignorant of the real issue, all you're doing is perpetuating the probability of more people getting hurt and more security issues being overcome. I hope that makes sense. The more you go into security, the more security is just going to turn into oppression and more destruction. And I really believe that. Number 25, we both agree that society has got lots of problems. What difference does it make if society got this way intentionally? Oh, I'm sorry, I misread that. We both agree society has lots of problems. What difference does it make if society got this way intentionally engineered by a group of people, or got this way as a tendency of people acting independently? Why do you make that distinction? That's weird. I don't think I've ever made that distinction. If I have, I would have to know what I stated, but nevertheless, the engineered people... Let me step back, actually. Let me try to figure out the best way to explain this. I don't support a conspiratorial worldview. There's the invisible men behind the curtain, as denoted in Zeitgeist 3. The infamous they are temporal. They are put there. They become into that position because of their value systems and their connections in business and government and the monetary system. And they hold high positions of power. They want to maintain those positions of dominance because that's what's been reinforced in their lives, and that's what they know. It should become no surprise the elitism of people like George Bush, coming from Skull and Bones, the secret society of Yale, coming from his family, his grandfather, who was a known Nazi. There's a heavy elitism that was put forth in value systems, so you can pretty clearly see who George Bush is and why he thinks the way he does, I think, loosely speaking. I've never met George Bush, but I've seen enough information. I've watched him enough, certainly, to see how sick and how basically he would just lie perpetually. But that's what all leaders do. Nevertheless, the men behind the curtain, it is a tendency. Their very culmination is still the tendency. There's really no difference. As far as the engineering of society, yes, there's tons of things that are constantly engineered for the benefit of the few, and that's been going on since the beginning of time. And the only way to overcome that is to begin addressing the root causes that set that seed of elitism. And in society, a better way to explain it actually is that the elitism that the the people at the top, the elitism that they experience, the value systems that they perpetuate, they try their best to push that value system onto the rest of the public, or at least a part of that value system. They want a greedy culture, because if everyone's greedy, then people will be much more nonchalant when you see, say, someone invade a country and take all the resources with really no legal reason or really no reason at all. So people have grown to be very despotic, and it's because of the value systems that are put forward. Same with the Catholic Church, or any of the churches for that matter. These value systems are created to perpetuate the institutions. So given that, it's all a tendency, is my point. And I don't differentiate between the two, except in isolation when I'm making a specific point. If I'm talking about something like 9/11 or all the early false flag things, or Operation Northwoods, yes, you have positions of power and control creating illusions for the public to manipulate them to support their agendas. And then at the same time, you have to realize that those very people are a product of the system. And that's where the real focus should be, on eliminating those tendencies that cause that type of value system. Number 26. Would legitimate violence exist in the Venus Project? Every single society in history of man relied on violence to take care of those people which were acting against the established order. This violence was legitimate according to it. If someone just tries to act against the social organization of the Venus Project by, let's say, killing someone in front of his or her eyes, would you use violence against him or her legitimately? Would the use of violence against him or her be legitimate if this person is not going to go to jail, but rather to a specialized institution? The act of apprehending him or her would still be an act of violence, so violence would be legitimate in the Venus Project. Well, the use of violence is, of course, a very heavy word. I think, in transition, if someone is doing something, that's offensive to somebody else, if you have someone kill somebody else out of jealousy, well, there's a problem there, and they might have a proclivity based on their environment, based on their development to want to kill other people. This is something you have to take them and remove them from society and get to the bottom of it, and that would come in the form of more of an analysis. The point is, you're removing people from society that have become a public threat is going to continue, and it's not that there's some fantasy or utopia that we're just going to suddenly be out of all of that. We're just going to make it very, very rare. I think through time, as this system develops, as the value systems are created, in other words, the value systems are generated by the social construct of people getting what they need and starting to eliminate all the egotistical things that serve no function whatsoever that have been imposed on the culture, you're going to see a dramatic drop. Does that mean it's going to vanish entirely? I don't know. It might get to a point where you have no need really for police at all, or very few. And I'm not a prophet, I don't know the answer to that, but nevertheless, violence is a very harsh word. We're not going to be even remotely as violent. The society will not be even remotely as violent as what you see today. There's many different points I could make about this. I was thinking the other day about the police department, and isn't it just what a great idea, right? Let's take a bunch of people that are not required to have a college education or any kind of thorough education. They don't study sociology or psychology or anything, and they're given a very small minimum wage, sometimes less than that, especially rookies. They're forced to work very, very many hours on average. I believe beat cops have I think it was an 8 to 10 hour day, if I remember correctly. Don't quote me on that, but they tend to work many more hours. They're put into environments that are very, very difficult, and because of this, a uneducated, low-paid, overworked people that are put into despotic environments, usually, some of them, at least that's where a lot of this violent police behavior comes from. And suddenly people are shocked when you see a cop push over some bicyclist that's just riding towards them, or you see a cop taser someone randomly, or you see a cop just beat the hell out of somebody for just insulting the cop or asking about his rights. This is to be expected. This is what we've created. It's amazing to me, and I know this is a little bit beside the point, but I'm going to probably talk about this in the new film. I find it just sad, just absolutely sad, because it's not the cops' fault. They're not given the benefit of education, of being highly rewarded, of denoting the patience that's necessary. And the police brutality and police corruption, of course, has gone on since the dawn of time. And in fact, in a lot of ways, there's very little difference between your average so-called street criminal and the police themselves. So when it comes to that type of violence, and I think this relates to your point, that's gone because there's nothing to support that anymore. All of that is gone. So when people are apprehended, they're done so humanely. I'm not saying that there won't be problems. I'm not saying that someone won't fight. These are things that are dealt with. In society, if someone's sick and they can't move, well, you pick them up and you take them to the hospital. If someone's violent, wielding a knife, and they want to take you down and they're extremely deranged, well, you do something to get the knife from them, and you capture and apprehend them, and you put them in a facility and you attempt to work with the problem. You don't just throw them into a concrete cell. So I hope that answers your question. Your term of violence is too extreme. There's much more humanity. It's not just violence. Number 27. As far as I understand it, the Venus Project would come after people make a great change in their value systems and their views of the world. But what if some sick minds do not want this transition to happen and want to stay with their old value systems? Would they still be tolerated in the Venus Project? What will happen to them if their value systems are damaging to the Venus Project? Again, that's a very complex question. There's a spectrum that I can discuss. If you have an indigenous culture that doesn't support, say, for example, the Amish can be provided for in the system. There's really no problem for that. The Amish, it's in an odd way, the Amish don't take up a lot of energy. Their simplicity is actually quite wonderful in abstraction. There's plenty of things you could talk about that are problematic with such a culture, but nevertheless, there's no reason they can't be supported for. As far as I think what you're going at is, say you have a Venus Project culture on one side and, say, a capitalist culture on the other. Well, you're going to have a big problem if that's the case, because the value systems will definitely come and clash. And the Venus Project culture, the resource-based economy, is much more vulnerable because of the values that are supported, because against the aggressiveness of the capitalist society. So that's going to be a difficult ongoing thing, which is why in the development of this, as we educate people, we have to be as vast and as widespread as possible. And that's really what it comes down to. We have to begin the persuasion to talk about it. And really, it's the system as it grows and the value of it is presented, and the obviousness of all the technical elements that we've discussed come to fruition. The system will have what you call a value adaptation. We're going for social therapy in a lot of ways. That's what our culture needs. One massive social therapeutic I don't know how to describe that, but we have to realign society based on value systems that are actually representative of people living and working together in a positive way, and that's really what it comes down to. Number 28. What do you think local chapters should be focusing on? Local chapters should be focusing on regional events and things that are happening in their area, news that might come out. It's, there's plenty of, in my hometown, there's all these tiny little newspapers that people put out. So if you have that in your hometown, do put like a tiny little ad for no money, just to do it, going to your local website. I'm speaking in the United States just abstractly. So if you have a local chapter that's in Minnesota, I believe there's a Minnesota local chapter, you want to have a little event every now and again, maybe once a month if you have the people to do it. And just, keep active and do things. And, of course, post news and make your presence known. The chapters are very important. I expect to make a very big impression once these chapters start going. And a lot of people that congregate on the main site that say in English, that live in the United States, they can begin to start to spread and congregate in their local communities. And that's going to be very, very powerful once we do that, because more actions can be taken and more recognition will be acknowledged. Because if we can get all sorts of press from different small cities or even larger cities, that's just going to eventually capitulate, and it's going to make more and more interest. And not to mention, once the press gets wind of this new organization that has large chapters in every single state and a lot of major cities, you're going to start to see the ignoring start to fade. They're not going to ignore us as much because it's going to become much more dominant and much more organized. So the chapters are very, very important, and I commented on that earlier. And there was two parts of this question. What are your thoughts on our country regarding the state of affairs, resources, etc.? Our country is an absolute mess. I think in the first part of the activist orientation guide, economically speaking, I go through all of that stuff. As far as the state of affairs, again, it's an absolute mess. There's a meeting going on. I don't have the article in front of me, and I've been waiting for more feedback before I post anything. There's a meeting that would happen yesterday and Monday in Russia that, I'm sorry, I don't remember the name of it right now, but there's a lot of speculation happening on the U.S. dollar. And if what is being speculated upon comes to fruition, then the country is going to be in much worse shape, because we're looking at the removal of the dollar as the world reserve currency. And the ramifications of that could be staggering. I don't like to speak ahead of myself. I try very carefully. There's so many variables when it comes to economics. When it comes to these meetings, there's so many things that you don't see that are not reported by the mainstream media. And I always try to, it takes time to figure it out. That's why hindsight's always 20/20. That's why you can always go back, and look at the Great Depression and see all the incredible problems and all the manipulation that went on during that, and all the deliberateness in certain levels of what occurred, not to mention the absolute failure of things. You can begin to differentiate between fact and fiction, but unfortunately it takes a lot of time because you never get enough information at that time. So generally speaking, I think I've made a lot of comments on the state of affairs. Economically, it's an absolute mess. It's not a profit, I can't tell you. Resources in America, I really don't even know, because we import so much. And I don't think there's that many, extreme resources. It's I find it interesting as an aside that countries like Africa, which have the most destitute societies, actually have some of the most incredible, most valuable resources. I guess this goes back to John Perkins a little bit. We strategically went in there and we robbed these people blind, destroyed their communities. And if there was any logic to resources based on region, the region with the most resources would naturally be the most wealthy and should have the most fruitful society. Unfortunately, in the grand theft known as capitalism, that isn't the case. Number 29. Would you know if Canada has a fiat system? Do we use the fractional reserve banking system? Yes, of course, absolutely. You can find that information out for yourself. It's total fiat, and I don't quote me on this, but I don't think they use any reserve ratio in the Canadian system, bizarrely, which means they can do whatever they want. But no, they're intimately tied with the U.S. in that regard. Number 30. Peter, please explain to listeners that a resource-based economy is not a form of government. That's a big topic because you go into the semantic argument of the term government. When I use the term government, it's a bunch of people sitting around in a room making laws and establishing budgets and figuring out who to steal more resources for, or who to defend against who are trying to steal your resources. That's basically what government is. And that's what I refer to when I talk about government, this monetary-based, meaningless, self-preserving institution that, just like a corporation, wants to maintain its power basis. So a resource-based economy has an entirely different infrastructure. You could say there's governance in incorporation because, yes, there's a systems approach to society. There is an orientation and an organization to it which is governing, so to speak, if you want to use that term, what society is doing. The way I see a resource-based economy working out in the transition into a larger system is that you have these cities that are created, and the cities have built into them all the necessities that are required. You're not going to have everything. You'll have to get resources from other areas of the planet. I'll get to that in a second. These cities are self-contained as much as possible. They're absolutely clean. They're all running on recyclable energy. There's no pollution, at least beyond anything that's absolutely needed. In other words, only if it's absolutely needed do you have to do something that pollutes. And as I've explained in the addendum, and as Fresco's also pointed out, there's really very little need to do half the things we're doing, which are causing the great majority of pollution that we see. Once you have this set up, you have people provided for in the city complex, and you have resources coming in from other city complexes. And what you end up with are tons and tons of cities, or massive structures that are all interconnected, and perhaps are somewhat holographic in their awareness of what's actually happening on the planet. So everyone's aware, say in one city in what you could call, the Eastern North America, they're actually aware because of the computerized system of how much of a particular resource is in existence in Africa. It's all intimately connected and utterly transparent. And because the system's approach, goods that are required, which again, all that's required for society really, and I'm not saying right now because there are many, many problems, but all that's required for society really is the creation of goods and services for the people to live their lives. And that's really it. That's really it if you really think about it. And I'm not saying that at this stage that's all there is. I'm saying in the higher abstractions of what's really important to people. There's value system arguments you could have, but nevertheless, if you give people what they need and they can live their lives and they can travel and they can create and they can join other institutions that are working on creation, then I say that's beautiful and that's really what society is. people living freely, absolute freedom, not the corporate fascism, not the governmental oppression, not the illusion of security, and all the things that are perpetuated in our modern day. So, back to my original point, you have these cities that are basically all over the planet, and they're interconnected technologically, and they all share the same information. And you will have people that the rotating interdisciplinary teams that work in each city, and they could work in larger collectives too. And that's to be seen, but they all work together in a holistic way. And this is what these terrified people are so afraid of, that have to bring up the term world government over and over again, assuming that any type of society where the world's working together is going to lead towards abuse. That is really erroneous when you put all of this together from the source. In a monetary system, absolutely. The last thing we need is a world government by big banks and the corporations of what you call a world monopoly, as I state and clarify in Zeitgeist Addendum. So that's really what it comes down to. It's creating a systems approach to resource management and distribution for people. And of course, many research projects and everything else, and high enlightenment of education. This is what needs to be focused on. And once those basic things are implemented, it's not a form of government because everyone can contribute. And this has been talked about a lot in the 83-page activist guide. So please reference that and try to get a full sense of what we're describing here. I get very agitated with people that throw out the world government thing, and because it's just so erroneous and so based on nothing. I mean, if you want to split hairs, we already have world government. They're called trade organizations. We already have pure world government based on banking collusion in the floating markets. It's already there. The fear of world government that these religious people put out there constantly, that they derive from the end of the Bible, the mark of the beast, and all of this crazy stuff that sadly enough continues to perpetuate, pushed upon, accelerated by these despotic mentalities that I won't name, that you can probably figure out immediately who I'm talking about, that have nothing but this abstract fear of this Illuminati-driven world government of the elite, and they're going to kill everybody. These guys are basically empty minds with distorted value systems that they've committed to, and now they perpetuate it. And it's horrible because we have a growing dissonance in this movement of this subculture that actually thinks we're Satanists or promoting the Satanist Luciferian one world government, one world religion nonsense. And if you haven't seen that, type stuff like that into YouTube, and your mind will be blown by I hate to say it, the lunatics that are promoting this idea. And I'm very serious when I bring that up because it's growing, and it's something that we're going to see more and more of as we get bigger. We're going to see a lot of religious opposition and a lot of convoluted opposition, which could breed, unfortunately, some very despotic mentalities that could lead to. I'm not even going to say things like that. You never know what to expect with this current value system and people's fear. Fear is tremendous fear towards what we're describing, unfortunately, because unfortunately people are uneducated. Enough of that. Sorry if I'm rambling here, guys. I'm trying to get through these questions. I have 30 more minutes. I think I'll get through them for the first time. Okay, number 31. I personally find this wrong. Oh, sorry, there's a section here I missed. Are the wealthy and powerful people going to be punished during transition to the Venus Project? I personally find this wrong, as the Venus Project aims to overcome such judgmental mentality and replace it with unity. I think our secret rulers are as much human as everybody else, and that shouldn't be punished. They should be integrated with the rest. And you know what? You're absolutely right. People with despotic mentalities, they're going to find that they're not reinforced anymore. And again, this is a complex topic of transition. The question comes: at what point do people like, even if it happened in, say, this lifetime, what point do people like Bill Gates or Warren Buffett, what point do they say, what, this is great, we're going to give all our money back to the system and get rid of the money and we're going to join the system? So I don't live in a fantasy world, and there's certainly no taking over anything. You have to get them to feel embarrassed by what they're doing. And as the society grows aware of this, they will cower and they will look at how sick what they've done is. It really is a tremendous sickness for anyone to have, say, $50 billion. That is absolutely sick, because all they're doing is restricting that money from everyone else. If I was to be mathematical about it, I'd say that the goal of monetary acquisition in this culture would be for you to live your life in a comfortable manner for the rest of your life. So you can mathematically figure out what your annual your annual salary, so to speak, would be, acquire, say, what would probably be like $2 or $3 million for a person who's, say, 20 years old, and they could live the rest of their life off the rest of that money and never have to work again, and they could be comfortable. I'm not advocating that. I'm just making a point. So when you put that into perspective, then you put these guys in perspective, they have like $50 billion. What they're really doing is, in their utter excess, is they're limiting. This statement's been made before. I think Jacques made it, and I think it's a great statement, so I'm going to restate it. They are literally saying, hey, look at all those people dying of starvation over there. Well, that's not my problem, even though I could probably do something about it and still live my life. My family could live very well for the rest of our existences. But, hey, that's okay. That's just the way the world is. This is the type of mentality that's been created. These people are hoarding food with this money. They're hoarding life-saving medicine by hoarding all of this money. And that is the type of embarrassing guilt association that needs to be associated with them. Anyone that has that kind of money is an insult. I would be horrified to have $1 billion. I would feel sick to my stomach because I know that in this world, the suffering that exists, it's sick to think these people just can sit there and laugh and continue their lives without seeing the absolute atrocity of such a thing. Not to mention the interest that's charged on the money that they hoard is the interest that you're paying, and that's for another topic. Number 32. When are we going to start working on the central database? I know that seems to be something we can concentrate on in the construction of the first city, and our biggest project now is spreading awareness. But the fact is, history has shown us that the biggest changes in society have come from the hard work of a very few. If we, the movement, have something physical to show the world, even a prototype of the central database, we will gain more than enough support to accomplish our basic goals. And I completely agree with you, my friend. And first of all, I want to acknowledge your statement that true change in society has come from a very few. There's the old Margaret Mead quote, which I love, which is that all it takes is a small group of thoughtful people to change the world, and indeed, that's the only thing that ever has. So, in regards to the central database, I have actually literally given thought to building a website dedicated to this. I have, in fact, in a later question here, let me just jump to it very briefly. Which it asks about, it points out a program called Wolfram Alpha, WOLFRAM space ALPHA. And it's a very interesting program that's been created. I'm looking more into it, which essentially is doing very close to what we're going for. There's also other things that Google have been doing that you can enter in questions to get a response that's in a human form. I mentioned before that kind of Jeopardy thing, tongue-in-cheek, where they're going to have a programmed computer. They might have already done it, where the computer is going to be programmed and fed in text questions, and it's going to respond by searching a massive database of information to respond to the questions. That's a pretty good accomplishment. I have no idea if that actually happened. This technology is there. Artificial intelligence will nothing but capitulate this. So, we can start working on that. There's so many other things as far as communication that I want to take care of, as you denote. But by all means, if you are a programmer, and if you, say, have of programs that are currently in existence that could be built upon, such as Wolfram Alpha, please email me information. I'd love to. This is something that I will talk about more in the film. I haven't had a chance to get to that point of the research because I've been so busy. But nevertheless, building a central database would be extremely impressive, especially if we can mock it up in a way that people can relate to it and see the beauty of it and how it would relate to social organizations such as creative invention, improvement of current inventions, and things like that. Okay, number 33. So my question to you is, how do I go about informing people who feel powerless, who have apathy towards the issues at hand, and who are religious and don't really consider views outside of their own? Well, you very carefully, you have to try to find common ground. I think I've talked about this before. You have to really be gentle with it. And if they're powerless, well, that's no excuse. You have to, if they're apathetic, well, there's plenty of things that you can give them examples for that I think should lure them in. What I like to do is explain to people that their occupations, which we all have to deal with, back to that bizarre guy who did the gun or no gun I talked about earlier, Stefan, who did the review of Zeitgeist Addendum, he makes the statement that we have volunteerism in society where where volunteerism, it's your decision and your freedom to get a job and to work. Well, it might be your decision to get a job and work at different places. You might be able to pick one company over another, though, as you know, very often that isn't the case, because most of the people I know are not in occupations they actually enjoy. They do it because they have to. Nevertheless, he makes this point as though that it's just up to you, and it's not. Everyone is hindered in this system, and they have to get a job in the corporate system. Well, corporate being a general term, in the labor system. They have to sell their labor for income, and if they don't do it, then they're not going to get money, and unless they're on welfare or something or supported by the state, they're not going to survive. So there's no freedom there whatsoever. It's an illusion. So, excuse me. So my point being relevant to this question, if you explain to somebody that, say they are a bartender, and I've done this with bartender friends, and I say, hey man, you know that we could automate this full bar. You know that we could put kiosks in front of the entire bar. You could have a machine, which probably already exists, which can make perfect drinks nearly 100% of the time with no variance, built into the bar. Someone punches in their order, maybe custom, and the drink is made right under them in the bar itself, and it pops right up, and that's it. That's the end of bartenders. That's the end of all the noise of people screaming. I live outside of Manhattan, and going to a bar is an absolute nightmare. I usually don't go to a bar at all, but the few times I get dragged there, I'm usually horrified by the utter disorganization and chaos. It doesn't have to be that way. You can set this up. You don't need one person working in an establishment like that. And I explain this to these guys, and they say, well, that's great, but then I'd have to get another job. And I say, well, wait a minute. Don't you understand that the ramification of that is that if you were, say, able to replace your job with the machine, and you took the money, and the machine did your job, wouldn't that be great? You'd never have to work. And that kind of triggers a response. And then I'd point out the larger reality that automation is powerful enough at this stage that you do not need great majority of the general mundane jobs, especially in the food service industry and stuff like that. And you should be free. The society should be reorganized to allow for your freedom on that level. And that's when it slowly triggers. That's when they finally realize that they've been had. Or they've not been had per se, but there's a deliberate withholding of social efficiency in our system, which could enable us to all be free and not have to do the drudgery-based, monotonous labor that constantly inhibits us, makes us depressed and miserable, and wastes the best years of our lives. So that's a good way to approach those that are apathetic, if you pin them down with that. As far as the religious, as I stated, you have to be very careful and try to denote the fact that what we're promoting is really what all the religious people have always talked about. I find it horrifying when I meet people that are supposedly Christian, and they have the most violent mentalities. I loved it when Jacques was on Larry King, and they asked Jacques what he thought of Christianity. He said, I think it's great. When are they going to put it into practice? And that's exactly what it comes down to. It's not whether Jesus existed or not that matters. It's the value systems. It's the institution that's despotic. There are plenty of beautiful things that exist in every religion, and you can utilize those and describe that the Venus Project is an absolute advocation of those reciprocal notions of value. Granted, there are plenty of problems in these religions, such as good and evil and the idea of this perpetuation, this duality. But you can transcend those. Focus on the positive. But I'm back to the notion of these violent Christians that talk of violence. How lost have they become? I consider myself to be more Christian than 90% of the Christians out there in an abstraction, as bizarre as that might sound, at least based on philosophy. Number 34. In the transition period, who will lead society? Someone has to be the source for leadership, as not everyone has equal knowledge nor equal ability to lead. From my observations of humans that assume positions of leadership, abusive, unproductive, selfish behavior is an emergent property of the leadership role. People can only perform as well as their education experience allows. Zeitgeist Movement won't work unless some individuals are in charge of it. Those individuals are human and will likely abuse their power unintentionally, most likely. Well, I can't say I agree with that. First of all, you have to have people in the positions of organization or so-called leadership. I guess that's my position. The Zeitgeist Movement is trying our best to keep everything consistent, and we're not going to support things that completely deviate, and we're going to bring in everybody that supports the general foundation. The issue of leadership is coming back to who has the most knowledge, who has the most experience with what you're dealing with, who understands the direction the most. Naturally, the Venus Project is the hub for this. Jacques Fresco is the hub for this. And any social transitional issues such as the technology to be implemented into a new system should go to Jacques. And And that's where it begins as a general form of leadership. So the leadership is there, and I'm doing my best to learn consistently as much as possible to help guide as much as I can. Obviously, there's always opinions and subjective whims that happen to come to fruition because there's always uncertainties. And that's where opinions honestly emerge. It's dealing with uncertainty. So, but your real point, based on the abuse of power, I don't agree with that. There's plenty of examples of people that have organized certain things. When you don't have things that reward your corruption, then the corruption has no basis to exist. And it's that simple. And without the monetary system, without the endless need for this parasitic behavior, this paralyzing behavior, people will not be rewarded for the things that they're currently rewarded for. We will not look up to people that have tons of money. We'll see them as aberrant, and as I certainly do now. We will understand that the leadership is there to help and to organize, and the leaders themselves will fall into that role as well. I can't predict the future. Corruption at this stage in transition will probably likely occur in different facets. I've already seen pockets of corruption in the Zeitgeist Movement. People that claim to be in the movement, yet they're selling lots of things on eBay, or they're doing underhanded things to gain money. And they try to defend it and say, well, this is the system we live in, I have to do this, but I can tell just by their mannerisms and the way they write and what they're doing that they're basically being corrupt. It's not a power corruption, but nevertheless, I have all the faith in the world that when this starts going and larger organizations emerge, a mutual respect will develop. And because we're not dealing with mass amounts of money and we're not a business, there's a much lower propensity for that type of corruption. And if corruption does manifest, it can be overcome fairly quickly because there's really nothing to keep that person where they are if they choose to be corrupt. So I hope that makes sense. It's a difficult question. The real foundation, as I've always said, and as Jacques always said, it comes down to the foundation of the corruption. Why? And if you eliminate the need for that corruption, there's no basis for it. So if it's not reinforced and not rewarded, why is someone going to do it? Number 35. Excuse me. I've noticed that you seem to be getting a lot of similar questions, and sometimes you answer questions you've already answered. Shouldn't the questions asked and the answers given be written down somewhere for people to read before posting new questions, an FAQ of sorts? Yes. In fact, I'm developing a knowledge database that has been in development. We have a programmer that's working on it right now. And basically what we're doing is we're going to make a searchable database. I'm going to go back through all of my questions and answers, which I have. And a lot of you, thank you very much for those of you who have done this, have painfully transcribed these radio addresses, and I'm just blown away by that. And I'll definitely come in handy when we do this. What I'll eventually do, though, is given the amount of time I have, I will hand type to make it clear, because sometimes my speech isn't that clear, and you guys know I tend to ramble a little bit. But nevertheless, I'm going to definitively answer each point in a ongoing database, a knowledge database that everyone can search, everyone can find a pre-existing question that they might think they need to ask already, again, but they realize it's not there. They realize it's there, so they can address questions that are not there. So yes, we're doing that. And I can't wait to have that. Number 36, what kind of numbers do you think our movement needs before we have enough to say, go to Congress and push for the monetary system's removal and implementation of a resource-based economy? Well, first of all, you can throw Congress out of there. It's going to be much larger than that. Congress will not be the first to move forward with this. I say that with a certain degree of tongue-in-cheek, mainly to the effect that I have a highly negative disposition. It's certainly not going to happen in China either, and I doubt you'd see it in North Korea. But nevertheless, this is going to probably happen. The issue is the numbers have to be strong in virtually every country. Once we have a very good pool of people committed, active, say, hypothetically speaking, say 1 million people in every country, and there's 200 countries. We'll base it per capita on percentage. So it depends on how many people you have. If we had 1 million people in the United States based on 300 million person population, that's not massive, but nevertheless, that's something that the public has to see. They have to acknowledge this. And once you have that number, if you continue that, you're going to see exponential growth in the interest. And I think that's definitely going to grow, especially as the problems of the monetary system continue and the awareness of technology continues. So the answer to your question, I really don't know exactly, but if we have 1 million people, arbitrarily speaking, in every country, that would be enough to start making strategic moves against all nations. Not against, I don't want to use that terminology, but you go to the heads of every nation, you begin to speak to different people in Congress. Like, I'd love to present this to, say, Dennis Kucinich. I'd like to see his reaction. I don't think he'd be in full support of it, but I have a lot of appreciation for Dennis. He's not as much of a nationalist as Ron Paul is. Ron Paul is very, very adamant in his worldview, is small government and all that stuff, which I appreciate Ron Paul too. I appreciate all these guys, but there's some problems there that they're not paying attention to. Nevertheless, in each country, you find representatives and you begin to interact with them. You begin to make the presence known in each country, and then slowly, you begin to sort of gain, sort of like what Martin Luther King did. He was able to finally get into the White House and talk to Lyndon Johnson and discuss the need for the African Americans to vote and the need to stop segregation. It's going to be a slow process. It's not going to be a negative process. There could be protests along the way, but nevertheless, to summarize it quickly without rambling so much, we need to have a group of people, big groups of people in each country, and begin a steady move with highly stratified, highly strategic to engage the governments that exist at that time. That will basically be it. And as the numbers grow, more ideas will come. And much more media will be presented too. In the end, it's really about the public slowly getting away from their current value systems and joining this enlightened value system, as I dare to say. That's going to be really the first step, and that's what I talk about the most. And there's plenty of time to think about how to approach the establishment once we have the numbers to do so. So let's focus on the numbers first. Number 37. I have a few related questions regarding artificial intelligence. Have you seen the project Alf from Alpha? And I just mentioned this. And he goes on to say it resembles artificial intelligence responses for maintenance and resource-based economy. So we talked about that, and yes, that's great. I did glance at that. I'm going to look more into it. My other question may sound a bit far-fetched, but given the level of AI that you describe as being in charge of maintaining a resource-based economy, it may very well come up to a point. What do we do if AI achieves full autonomy and sentences? Sorry, this got cut off. What do we do if AI reaches full autonomy and sentience on their own? Do they then stop being mere tools and instead become full participants of a resource-based economy? Well, that's yet to be seen. Once artificial intelligence reaches a point, say in the likes of Ray Kurzweil, then you're going to have a much more, what would be a much more fanciful relationship to these machines than just using them as tools. But in the end, they're still just tools. I really have to reiterate that. I mainly because of the weird fear that people have that they're still very paranoid out there. People are they're afraid of the unknown, and unfortunately, they think technology is going to be invariably going to be negative and work against the people in some way. And of course, as we've seen historically, in a lot of ways, they're right. But it's our decision as far as what to do with them. So I'm not an expert in artificial intelligence. I read a lot about it, and I'm going to be doing a lot more research on it for the film. But nevertheless, I would have to say, intuitively speaking, based on what I understand inferentially, yes, artificial intelligence will greatly exceed our capacity, greatly. And they will become, in a lot of ways, the decision makers most likely in a much more in-depth way than we can probably think about today. And I don't even like talking about that because it's too foreign for people. People are far too terrified from that. So we'll just leave it at that. Number 38. With the new dilemmas and issues we always have to face due to semantics such as misinterpretation, biases, dogmas, appealing to emotion, and subjectivity in our current language-based systems, how can we go about developing, redesigning, improving a linguistic form of communication or method that avoids all those and is instead grounded to reality rather than romanticizing it, a language that isn't irrational but is instead based on objectivity, impartiality, and science? I'm assuming the scientific method can be applied to this problem in order to arrive at a satisfactory solution. Well, first of all, I really appreciate your use of your referenced words there as far as describing the necessity, and I'd have to agree with you as far as I think Jacques would agree as well in his statements and in what he's written in his books, that there's definitely the need to remove the subjectivity in language and all the romanticized stuff that we use. I mean, I still fall victim to it. I still say the sun rises, or I still look up, where we really should be looking out. Stuff like that. Those are mood issues, temporal context. But nevertheless, there is an importance to it when you get into more complex forms of communication. So unfortunately, I don't know how this is going to develop. This will be something that linguistic professionals perhaps can consider more so. The scientific method will definitely come into play. I mean, that's what the whole thing is about. Finding a way for people to listen to the words that I'm saying, and knowing what I'm saying as much as can possibly be expected, because I'm really just talking at you guys now, hoping that I communicate myself thoroughly enough that you can, with your parallel understandings or whatever, however parallel they are, can understand and relate to what I'm saying. You know, there's plenty of people that don't relate to what I'm saying. I've had numerous battles with people that email me that completely take what I say out of context. But nevertheless, I see the problem. I understand exactly what you're saying, and I don't have the answer to it. It's going to have to develop through time, but we know what the goal is, so we'll see how it goes. Certain fields already have it: science, technology, architecture. These are already languages in their own right that you know what you're looking at. You know what people are communicating. There's always going to be some kind of gray area, most likely, but still much more objective than what we have now. So give that some thought. I always like feedback on that subject, and we'll find out. I really don't know. Number 39. In one of your radio addresses, you explained to us how distribution will work in the resource-based economy. You compared it with a library where people borrow books. The problem with this example, which I have, was that this specific book is not available to others. So in every city, you have to make sure that there are enough cameras or skating equipment. Is this practical in every city using current technology? Well, you know what? All you have to do is look at modern stores today. I think if you go into any city, very often they have a statistically generated number of laptops that are on sale in, say, a computer store to gauge the necessities of people that come in. It's a developmental thing. Obviously, you have to learn how many people live there and what their proclivities are, and you can do that through a form of survey and any kind of form of feedback. I don't see this as an issue at all. I think the abundance can be there can be an overrun enough statistically based where people can get whatever they need. If there's some irrational surge, say, it can be dealt with, and things can come from other places. People, it's not a utopia. If there's a delay in something, well, you know, that's just something that people have to deal with. But if your fundamental question is, I don't see it being an issue at all because it's already in existence now. It's almost as though we take all of our corporation stores and warehouses and just turn them into distribution centers. So, number 40. If you have TV shows, who will decide when and which TV shows will be presented? Well, you will. I mean, if you want to create a TV show, I think the equipment can be made available, and you can put it on what would be the Internet, because I think eventually the Internet will utterly overpower the television. There'll be a complete hybrid made. And then you would make your show, and then it would be blasted out to the universe, and anyone that wants to watch it can find a way to search for it, and popularity statistics can be created where you can see what's popular amongst the culture, and you can watch what's popular. I don't see any issue with that at all. I mean, there's no one who decides. You decide. And if it gains interest, you know, then that's the nature of it. But there's always going to be in the transition a necessity to try and, again, engage the social therapy. I mean, what the stuff that's on television now that people have grown to like is quite despotic and quite negative. It has a severe negative retroaction in the way people view the world. I think just as a person walking down a dark alleyway, their fear of, say, being mugged is generated usually from movies that they've seen. In fact, you'll probably find that they behave the same way that the actors in the film behave. Simultaneously, I guarantee you that the robber has probably seen a number of films where people are getting robbed, and he might pull the gun out in the exact same manneristic way. He plays the part. So everyone kind of plays the part, and this is influenced from a lot of the violence that we see on television and the culture now. So that's a complex point. I think that in time you won't need any form of regulation, but I think it's very important to focus television shows on education and things that are actually relevant. We're just so backwards right now. We need people to take the reins and make relevant documentaries and make relevant films, give relevant news. The irrelevancy, I'd say, is 90% on what you see on television today. And unfortunately, people like it, and that's because they've been conditioned to do so. So we have to break that conditioning. Number 41. I think that we can agree that transparency is essential to the movement. I'm, however, disturbed by how this is actually implemented in practice. In a recent announcement, there have been multiple projects being worked on mentioned, but their progress and details are nowhere to be found. It seems it's being developed behind closed doors without community involvement. Also, there is a Zeitgeist Movement team signed under this announcement, yet I have no idea who this is or even how many there are and what they're working on. Well, the Zeitgeist team is all of us, and the immediate team are the collection of content managers and moderators and people that help me. We're all just doing administrative stuff. And of course, Jacques and Roxanne are part of the team as well, as I am of theirs. At this stage, it's everybody. I mean, people that send me feedback in the forum, I'm not creating a hierarchy here. I mean, I'm trying to guide things as best I can, given that a lot of attention is focused on me, and Jacques and Roxanne are doing the same thing. But there's the Zeitgeist team is everybody. And as far as agreeing on transparency, I'm really confused on what you're referring to. Please send an email or clarify this, because first of all, there's very little. All the projects that we're doing are posted on the projects page, and if you want to get into the projects forum and the project community, it's all right there, very transparent. You just have to join. So I'm not quite sure what you mean. Next question. There are some initiatives. Number 42. There are some initiatives which are very close to the Venus Project's goals and ideas. The most close and prominent one I found is open source ecology, and they give some links such as factoryfarm.org and openfarmtech.org. It is essentially the Venus Project built. It is essentially the Venus Project already being built. Are you familiar with them? Would you consider opening up a dialogue with them? Maybe give an interview on your radio show. Maybe that's all very possible. But you have to remember something, that the Venus Project is not about just a self-sustaining ecology or what they refer to as open source ecology. I've glanced at these websites. This is about a cultural transformation. It's not just about communes and buildings and high technology and eliminating mundane jobs. It's about changing the culture. And again, maybe there's certain attributes that are inherent in what these links that you provided denote. But dialogue between anybody that's working on self-sustaining stuff would be great. But for you to say that it's essentially the Venus Project being built, that's not true, because the Venus Project is a larger concept. It isn't just a city. So I hope that's clear. I got 4 minutes left, so let me try quickly to get through as many of these. It's almost there. What is your solution with getting people into the movement and to stop being so What is your solution with getting people within the movement to stop being so anti-religious? I've seen some people become anti-religious for whatever reason they have. Can you remind people to stop talking about religion in a negative way, as it sets a tone of hatred towards religion that religious people can use against the movement? Well, obviously any type of so-called hate speech, anything that's heavily derogatory or calling names, I'm not interested in that at all. I think it's valid to be very critical of religion, as valid to be critical of absolutely anything, and every human has the right to do that. The reality comes down to how strategic you want to be. Anybody just bashes religion and dismisses people of religion needed to lay back a little bit more. As I said, there's plenty of things to identify with religion. Religion historically, outside of the establishment, as far as the text, as far as some elements of the value systems that are perpetuated, and they're not all good, believe me, but there are things that can be identifiable and harnessed and communicable and used to help people to see the light with the movement. As far as people being very anti-religious, I don't encourage that. People say part one of Zeitgeist is some crazy anti-religious, bashful thing. Actually, it's just presenting information. I may poke some fun at the irrationality of religion, which I think is very well needed. I'm not going to humor people. I'm going to be honest with people, but I'm also trying to be as open as possible and be as reasonable as possible, and of course be as strategic as possible, but not by just placating people. I can't do that. You can't just placate people. You got to be relatively honest. I mean, there's always a strategy in communication, and we all know that. But you have to be straightforward, and very often you're going to get a very negative reaction when you do that. But if people settle down a little bit, that have, say, strong religious identifications, and they start to think a little bit more clearly, which has happened with me, they start to kind of identify with it, and they start to say, well, you know what, yeah, the establishment's the problem. It's not Jesus or Christianity, it's the establishment. And they're actually mostly right, but I can talk endlessly about the positives and negatives of religion, but generally speaking, let's all play nice. Number 44, do you acknowledge that certain spiritual methods, tools, and modern technologies can be useful for expanding consciousness, reducing stress? Oh, well, yeah, understanding that we're all interconnected and the symbiotic relationship of what I call functional spirituality, and instead of giving a quarter to some homeless person, which of course you should do anyway, in abstraction I do it, and for many reasons, but instead of just doing that and feeling placated, why don't you focus on the social roots that cause those problems to begin with, and that's what we're doing. That's what true interaction is. Number 45, what would happen if people in Western industrial countries simply got tired of being consumers? Would the people in Western industrialized countries ever get tired of being consumers? Would they get tired of watching their things become obsolete? Yes, it's our hope. If they are aware that the stuff that they have that becomes obsolete doesn't have to become obsolete, then by all means. Okay, I got 1 minute left here. Let me jump to the most relevant. There's only a few of it. Yeah, these are all okay. I'd like to know your opinion on the Council on Foreign Relations. What is their role in this corrupt system? I can't remember if you talked about them or not for sure. If you did, please share your opinions. Council on Foreign Relations is just another group of people that are just like the Bilderberg Group and those other related high echelon corporate government colluded organizations that have worked to carve out this country a little bit more for their own benefit, just like any other larger organization. It's a massive collusion of interest. There's a lot of absurd stuff, socialist stuff that comes out about the Council on Foreign Relations, convoluted conspiracy theorist stuff that I tend to just ignore. It's just another club, elitist club, no different than all the other ones that are already in existence. So I think that's it for this radio broadcast. I hope I haven't rambled too much. I hope I've answered most of your questions. If I didn't answer your question, please quickly go and put them in a new forum thread, and I will find them. The sooner you get there, the faster I'll answer them. Excuse me, the higher probability they'll be answered. And that's it. I really appreciate everybody's work. We're making a lot of impact, and my heart goes out to all of you that are doing their best to push this forward, because it's going to be an uphill battle for sure. And don't forget to email the German Zeitgeist, the German Facebook people that have been destroying the Zeitgeist groups. All right, everybody.